Attention. We thank Reverend Taylor for reading the word. I just want to go back to one verse, and that being verse 5. And here it is. Abraham said to his servants, "Stay here with the donkey while I and the boy go over there. We will worship, and then we will come back to you." And for the next few moments, gentlemen, and everybody else assembled, I want to preach on the topic, when I can't talk about it. Oh, when I can't talk about it. Men, black men in particular, I see you. God, unfortunately, allows me sometimes to see through you. And which means I ultimately feel you. Yeah, we live under a weight that's hard to explain. A precarious existence where we're judged not just on results, but on the and then some. A moving goalpost no one ever defines, but always expects us to hit. If it goes right, great, but you better not mess it up. Don't fumble the bag, don't slip, don't let them say you couldn't handle it, because every black man's opportunity becomes everyone else's. And if it fails, the blame is all yours. If it doesn't go right, then you didn't do enough. We've been told we didn't resist enough, didn't fight back enough, didn't escape enough when we were brought over here in chains. When we were enslaved, we were told we didn't do enough to free ourselves. And when we fought back, we were told we were reckless and caused more harm than good. When we were emancipated, we were expected to instantly build wealth, buy land, and have family stability, yet blamed for not being there enough for the same families that we were trying to support. When we fought for equality, we were told to calm down, be less disruptive, and stop asking for too much too soon. When we achieved success, if we couldn't keep it going, the blame fairly squarely on us. And so no matter what we do, I see you. It feels like we're never good enough, never respected enough, never given enough room simply to be me. Meanwhile, a white man can be a convict and still be seen as good enough. He can mistreat women and still be lifted into power. Can tear apart the family dynamic and still be praised as the solution for tomorrow. But a black man, we can't make one mistake. The stakes are always higher, and the burden is always ours to bear. And yes, under all that weight, we begin to crumble. Some of us have walked away from families, tried to escape communities that were trying to hold us together, and sold out for a moment of relief, only to end up trapped again, locked behind the walls of systems designed to profit off of our mistakes. We were wrong, but the why doesn't erase the weight. And when the world keeps telling us we're not enough, the cracks begin to show. One by one, we begin to fall, and there's no one to catch us. No space to cry out, no ear to hear us, no shoulder to lean on, because who wants to hear a strong black man admit he's struggling? No, strong black man, you have to have what it takes. That's the message, isn't it? Hold it together. Don't break, don't bend, and don't dare admit the weight is too much. But when it's too much, who can I talk to? Who can I really call on when the pressure is crushing, when the expectations are unrelenting, when the weight of it all feels like too much? Who can I trust, not just to listen, but to actually understand what I am carrying, to hear me without judgment, without turning my struggle into a weapon against me? What do you do when you feel like I can't talk to anybody about it at all? Not because they don't care, but because they don't get it, or they won't act right, or they just can't handle the truth of what you're dealing with. And so like us, Abraham knows what it feels like to carry the weight of it all. to try to do right by everyone and still feel like he's coming up short. Here it is. God promised Abraham a future, tells him he's going to make him into a great nation. And like us, Abraham steps out on faith. He leaves everything behind, his family, his home, the comfort of what's familiar, to follow a promise to a place he's never seen. But years go by and the promise feels like a setup. They're still barren. How do you build a nation when you can't even have a child? And like us, when things don't happen the way they're supposed to, Abraham tries to fix it. Any men in here know anything about trying to fix it? Here it is. Sarah, tired of waiting, comes up with a plan and tells him to sleep with his servant Hagar. Abraham, trying to keep peace, goes along with it. But now we got baby mama drama. Hagar gets pregnant and Ishmael and Sarah can't handle it. She flips the script, making Hagar the side piece who can't even be a sneaky link because everybody knows. Now the whole house is in chaos. Then God steps in again and reminds Abraham that the promise still stands. Despite the mess, despite the detours, God tells Abraham that Sarah will have a son, but Sarah overhears it and laughs, and not the kind of laugh you hear when someone is happy. This was the laugh of disbelief, the laugh of someone who's tired of hoping. And Abraham, he's stuck wondering if Sarah will ever believe like he does. But then the impossible happens. Sarah gives birth to Isaac. The laughter of disbelief turns into the laughter of joy. And for a moment, it feels like everything is falling into place. But just when it seems like the promise is finally here, the mess they made comes back around. Now that Isaac is here, Sarah wants Ishmael gone. She sees Ishmael, Abraham's firstborn, as a threat to Isaac's future. And so she tells Abraham to send Hagar and Ishmael away, and Abraham is torn. Ishmael is his son. Ishmael is his responsibility. How does he just let them go? And then on top of it all, God sides with Sarah. Let that sit for a minute. Abraham is stuck between being a father, listening to his wife, and obeying God. For just when Abraham thinks he can catch his breath, God decided this is a great time to test Abraham. God tells him to take Isaac, the child of the promise, the one he waited for, and offer him as a burnt offering on a mountain that God will show him. And I want to know this morning, who now can Abraham talk about this to? He can't talk to Sarah. Her mind is made up. This is the same Sarah who laughed at God's promise of Isaac, whose name means laughter. And now she's demanding that Hagar and Ishmael, whose name means God will hear, be sent away. And so how do you talk to someone who'd rather laugh at God than to hear God? Can't talk to Ishmael and Hagar because they've been hurt too much, mistreated too often. They're too vulnerable to handle the weight of what Abraham is carrying. He can't talk to his servants. The people who are meant to serve him can't carry this assignment with him. For some assignments can't be shared because there's only going to get in the way. And he can't talk to Isaac. How do you tell your son you've been sent to offer him as a sacrifice without crushing his spirit? Or making him doubt that God that taught him to trust. So now, Abraham is left carrying it all. The burden of the promise, the weight of his choices, the heartbreak of a divided family, and the overwhelming challenge of an assignment that doesn't make any sense. In times like this, when it feels like God doesn't see the weight I'm under, doesn't hear the silent screams in my heart, and doesn't understand what he's asking me to do, and if this is what God is telling me to do, should I even be talking to God? How in the world and why does God's assignment sometimes seem contrary to his word and promise? Why does God allow us, black men, to carry so much? To bear the weight of expectations, responsibilities, and struggles that others wouldn't survive? Why does God ask us to trust him when it feels like trusting him cost us everything? Why does God test our faith with commands that seem to contradict his promise? Why does God give us a vision for our future but make the road to it so hard? Why does God allow us to be judged by results, then demand faith when we can't see the outcome? These are the questions that sit heavy on our hearts. They're real. Am I talking to anybody in this house? Yes, Lord. They're real. They're real. They're honest. And Abraham shows us something, though. Everybody say, check out Abraham. Check out Abraham. Yeah, when God's assignment doesn't make sense, when the weight feels unbearable, and when the promise seems far off, I need everybody to understand God's not calling us to understand. God's calling us to stand on his word. Yeah, somebody say, check out Abraham. Right about here, God promised Abraham that the generational blessing would flow through Isaac. But now he's asking Abraham to sacrifice Isaac. How do you reconcile what God said with what God is asking? How do you obey when it feels like obedience will destroy the very thing you've been waiting on? But here's where Abraham shows us the way forward. When it feels like you can't talk about it, when no one around you understands, and when even God's assignment feels like it's a contradiction to his promise, look at Abraham. Despite everything, despite the pain of a divided household, despite the confusion of an unthinkable command, despite the pressure of carrying the weight alone, despite the emotions threatening to overwhelm him, despite the thoughts running through his mind, despite the drama of everything he's been through, despite the mistakes that led him here, despite the doubts that must have crept in, the Bible says that Abraham got up early in the morning, harnessed his donkey, and took two of his young men with him, together with his son Isaac. He split the wood for the entirely burned offering, set out and went to a place that God described to him. And I need everybody to hear me right here. The sooner you move according to God's word, the sooner he can show you what the manifestation of the promise really looks like. I need you to notice, God didn't tell Abraham to sacrifice on any mountain. He told him to go to the one I'll show you. In other words, God is saying, despite the dilemma I put you in, I'm going to show you the place I need you to display your faith in me. And when you do, I'll show you how I keep my word. And I need to talk to some folk right about here who are going through some stuff, and you're wondering why God put you there. And God is saying, this is where I want you to show me your faith. Right about here, this is where I placed you here. I'm working on it, and I need you to show me your faith. Because if you show me your faith right about here, I'm going to show you what I do. I'm going to show you how I provide. I'm going to show you how I make a way. I'm going to show you how I bring you out. I'm going to show you how I keep your mind. I'm going to show you how I keep you in perfect peace. This is where I need to see your faith. Abraham on the top of the mountain, not on the bottom. Abraham all the way up the rough side of the mountain. Abraham, it hurts, but there. Yes, it makes no sense, but there. Yes, Abraham, I need you to show me your faith right about. Oftentimes, you can't talk to nobody because there are certain levels of faith in which talking only becomes a distraction. There are times in life where we come to where we can't talk to anybody because nobody can help us do what we're assigned in the season. You want to, but you can't. That's why Abraham said to his servants, y'all know, see? Y'all come up here and do this Easter speech for me. Stay here with the donkey. The boy and I will walk up there. Worship. Anybody ready to go with me? Stay here. The boy and I will walk up there, worship, and then we'll come back to you. As Abraham left the servants, he simply says, we're going over there and worship, and we'll be back. And there are seasons, everybody listen, where you're going to have to leave those things that serve you to worship. Worship isn't about being served, but about making room for God. Somebody say making room for God. It's not about what you get out of it, but about who you make room for. Making room to believe, yes. Even when what God is asking doesn't make sense, worship clears the doubt and creates space for faith to take root. We're making room when we worship. Somebody say make room. Make room to receive because God can't pour into a full cup. And worship empties you of your fear, empties you of your pride, empties you of your control, so God can fill you with his presence and his promise. We're making room when we worship. Making room to surrender because worship shifts your focus from what you're carrying to the one who's able to carry you. Yes, Lord. Making room is what we're doing. When we worship, we're making room to trust because worship silences the noises of the world and amplifies the voices of God. We're making room when we worship, making room to obey because true worship isn't just about singing or lifting hands. It's about saying, yes, Lord, even when it costs you everything. Making room, yes, Lord, to be restored because in worship, God heals what's been broken. In worship, God strengthens what's been weakened. In worship, God revives what's been lost. We're making room in worship, making room to hear because in worship, God speaks. And when he speaks, he reminds you of his promise, his power, and his plan. And so worship because when you do, it won't let you come back the same. I need you just to nudge your neighbor. I'm right where I want to be right about now. I need you to nudge your neighbor and say, if we worship, we won't go back the same. If we worship, we won't be going. I know what the assignment is. I know what you're going through. But if you worship, you won't come back the same. That's where Abraham is with us. I know what my assignment is. I know I'm supposed to go offer Abraham. But if we worship, we won't come back the same. Is there anybody in here that knows how to worship? Anybody in here that knows worship will change some things? Yes, Lord. Worship. Somebody open up your mouth and say worship. Worship. I don't know who you came with. You might want to look over the room and say, come on, we got to worship. We got some bills at home. We got to worship. We got some problems at home. We got to worship. There's some sickness at home. We got to worship. There's some things that need to be healed at home. We got to worship. There's some breakthrough that needs to happen. We got to worship. There's some ways to be made. We got to worship. We got a lunatic in office. We got to worship. We got some stuff going on. We got to worship. There's some strange fruit in the land. We got to. How you worship? How do you worship? When you can't talk about it, how do you worship? You can't talk to nobody about it. How do you worship? You're burdened and overwhelmed. How do you worship? It ain't making no sense. How do you worship? Ain't nobody helping you. How do you worship? Let me tell you. When you can't talk to anybody about it, I need you to start talking about what God can do. I can't talk to nobody about it, but let me talk about what God can do. And why do you do that? Because there's always a word before the dilemma. Can you just tell somebody there's always a word before the dilemma? Yeah, before they got themselves in this dilemma, they all had a word. Yes, Lord. There was a word before the barrenness. God said, I will make you a great nation. The promise was set before the problem even showed up. There was a word before Ishmael. God's covenant didn't change. Even when Sarah and Abraham tried to fix it themselves. Yes, there was a word before Isaac. God declared, is there anything too hard for the Lord? Doubt didn't cancel the promise. God's power made it happen. And I just stopped by to tell somebody that nothing can mess up God's word. That's why we don't need to talk to anybody about it before we worship. Somebody say worship. Before you seek advice, before you explain yourself, before you try to make sense of it, you better worship first. Yeah. Because if his word is already settled, then your first response isn't talking about it, it's lifting God up. Can you just check your row real quick and say, are you ready to lift God up? Are you ready to lift God up? Are you ready to lift God up? Because on the way to worship, even though he's going through, even though he's overwhelmed, Abraham opens up his mouth and says, God will provide. Can you just look at somebody and say, God will provide? Yeah, can y'all just preach this with me? Put your preacher voice on and say, God will provide. Yes, look at somebody else and say, God will provide. If I can find a way to profess what God can do, God can find a way to prove that he's more than able. And so when they say it's not enough, God says I am, because God will provide. And when perfection is demanded, and God reminds us it's about faith, not a flawless performance, God will provide. And when it feels too much and the load is too heavy, God says stand still and watch me work, because God will provide. When the mess feels too far gone, God shows up in the middle of it, because God will provide. And when it feels like nobody gets it, God says I see you, because God will. God will. God will. God will. God will. God will. Is there anybody that believes it? 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 Late in the midnight hour, God will. When I don't know how, God will. 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 Come on, God will. God will. You talking to your future self. God will. My sick self. God will. The self that needs healing. God will. This is why you worship first. Before you try to explain it, before you try to defend it, before you try to fix it, everybody say worship. When the promise feels too far away, worship, because God. When the weight feels unbearable, worship. Why? When you don't know what to do next, worship, because being faithful isn't about what feels good. It's about what God has already spoken. Even when people fail you, even when the situation doesn't make sense, God will. And so the Bible says, late one Friday night, Jesus stood silent in the judgment halls. Jesus didn't say a word because the promise didn't need defending. Worship will make room for you. Friday afternoon, he hung on the cross. The weight of the world was on him, but he stayed in position. The promise didn't quit when the pressure gets heavy. As somebody say, worship God. Friday evening, he was placed in a tomb, and it looked like it was over, but worship reminds us God does his best work in the dark. And so Saturday, he waited in silence. No movement, no noise, no sign of life, but trust this, just because it's silent doesn't mean God isn't moving. And so early Sunday morning, He got up with all power, and what looked like defeat turned into the ultimate victory. The promise will always speak louder than the process. And I need somebody right about now who's in the process of being blessed, who's in the process of making yourself go, who's in the process of pushing, who's in the process of trying to make it through, who's in the process of not knowing how I'm going to make it. Here it is. I need you to worship right about here. I need some folk to worship and begin to make room for God. Somebody say, making room. Make him room. Make him room. Open up your mouth and 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 make him room. You need healing. Open up your mouth and make him room. You need provision. Open up your mouth and make him room. You need him to come through. Open up your mouth and make him room. Make him room. Because when you make him room, he'll bust that door wide open. And when the Lord shows up, 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 rams just show up in the bush. They want to know, what is God up to? Stuff shows up. Healing shows up. Provision shows up. Breakthrough shows up. Deliverance shows up. Power shows up. Peace shows up. Power. I need you to understand right about here that indeed whatever you need,